Sure.
And having the exhibit travel to Germany, some of the things that you talked about, specifically the piece where you're building a cardboard furniture, are those things that you would change or reconsider?
Yes. I mean, I mentioned that before. To a certain extent, you're only able to do what you're able to do given the time and the money and the spaces and so on. I think I would try to address that problem again, but with a different concept. So, to address the redefinition of a space, I think is necessary. But we just had a simple rule: whatever we do, we'll do through an artistic project, through an artistic vision, if you wish. And we don't want to be the designers of that. So, since we did have funds for commissioning works, that was one arena in which we wanted to do that. I would probably now just look for a different artist and probably have the museum in Germany involved in this, and sort of maybe even ask them to propose and organize something along those lines. The problem in this specific case is that this is going to be a new museum, so I don't even know the spaces. And with all the problems, all the excitement as well, but also all the problems. Yeah. Another thing that I would like to be able to do is something that is literally addressing the relation of the inside and the outside. So we had, obviously we had internet pieces exhibited in the galleries, and these by definition were, open to whoever was accessing this from the outside. If you were in Second Life, all of a sudden an avatar could become part of your environment, although that now that was this kind of blend between the real and the virtual space. However, something that would also involve the public space outside the museum in terms of either a billboard or a project that would physically take you outdoors and maybe back is on my to-do list. And something that I felt was not necessary to do. If you look at the history of participatory art, you're also looking at a history that is extremely anti-institutional. So looking elsewhere because you feel this is where things are possible, but not inside the museum. And out of that whole movement, which was very much felt in the media arts, definitely, to the point where these artists were looking for their own venues, their own festivals, etc. But certainly, still in every town, you have a number of artist-run spaces that have a clear function in being a lot more accessible to experimentation. So I felt that we didn't have to work on that conflict anymore, since that also has a long history now, over 20, 30 years. It's kind of an established landscape that's out there. And in a way, specifically throughout the 90s, this idea that you can work in an alternative space, but you can also work inside a museum, that's not a conflict anymore. And to a certain extent, this could actually open up those spaces to another audience, and that maybe the audience today is much more able to embrace those notions that seem to be so far removed from the idea of producing an artwork. You know, you want me to do the work? You're the artist, you should do the work. I'm here to just, you know, contemplate. So I think the landscape has changed over the last 10 years, and there are artists who work on various levels in various social environments as well, and then most importantly, the technologies with which we work today and with which we live today render every space so, they make each space so connected to other spaces at the same time. You are always connected remotely. A real space, potentially at least, is already a data space that this has to be somehow reflected in what we do as an institution, as a museum. And it's posing all kinds of problems, because then you don't know what you have, what you're getting. And one of the really insightful meetings in the preparation of the gift, the artist was coming 3 weeks before the opening, and we had gathered all the 40 volunteers, and they all had questions. So, how am I supposed to do this? My team was asking, so, how do we plan this? And he was constantly saying, well, basically he was not giving an answer. He was saying, well, this is a process, and you will see as you go along. This is actually about learning how to do that. And what I'm the photographer, what am I supposed to say about the project? And then, yes, you can talk about the whole frame, but you should also be personally taking responsibility in sort of finding your way of communicating this project. So I'm not prescribing how to frame this, how to communicate that. One thing that I haven't talked about is he was very clear about wanting another venue for this piece. So it would not only happen in the museum, but also in a newspaper, which happened, fortunately. At the very last minute, we got a daily paper in San Francisco called The Examiner, which is for free. It's one of these papers that they are commercially horrible, and it's just this for the train ride and for the 10 minutes in the metro, and it's sort of the very shallow idea of news. But they became so involved in this project that they printed whole pages of their paper with these portraits, and they set up a whole website. So for him, the importance was to establish two parallel venues. It would be exhibited in the museum, but it would also be exhibited. It's not me. It would also be exhibited in a distributed way throughout the city. And for him, that was, historically speaking, I'd say it's this idea that you try to get a whole different kind of audience as well interested in this process. I don't think that's so much an issue for San Francisco, actually, which seems to me a quite open city in terms of the public. But it certainly helped to also support and underscore this idea that a work can be reconfigured in so many different ways. And in the end, what we acquired as a piece was basically a database with the right to reprint any given number of works that would fit a wall, or whichever space we would give to that. The only requirement conceptually is that whichever selection we would make, it would have to mirror honestly the range of diversity that this project has produced.
actually wanted to bring up one is a point that Boris Royce makes in his essay, and I mean, he makes a number of points, but he writes, participatory art can be understood not only as a reduction, but also as an extension of authorial power. This is a statement, a comment he makes in relation to the notion of the death of the author in terms of structuralism and how that pertains to sort of the self-renunciation of the artist as an author in relation to different avant-gardisms. And also you talk about, I'm paraphrasing, that there's something beautiful, or the beauty of the participatory process, or the beauty of participation, which might suggest another, perhaps, allusion to an aesthetic condition, perhaps. So on the one hand, we have both the fragmentation of the authorial agency and the reconstitution of it through or dissemination of it into a social body, and then we also have the possibility of another aesthetic condition, if you will. And as you say in your writings, that these are problematics, right? Yes. There is no yes or no.
Yes. I would say yes. In the end, you cannot avoid that problem of the author. There is, in the end, always an author, and there is, in the end, a piece by Jochen Gertz called "The Gift." Although there is as much co-authorship as possible become part of this. He does say he wants to sort of vanish from that process. He wants other people to take charge of it, but he's also the author in that position, or in his function of sort of pushing us to produce something as on a scale like this, to also so he, for instance, insisted on coming back in person and meeting everybody else who was involved in this. And I thought, this could have been just done by us, so representing him. So he became part of this process in a very crucial fashion. But what I really like in his work, in comparison maybe to some others, is that this process is always about a reflection on what constitutes a public. And it's not just about collaboration. Now we're collaboratively painting the wall. And it's not only about a platform. Actually, one of the outcomes of such a show is also how important it is to very precisely frame the process so that there is a border and something to act against or within. So it is not just an open invitation, which becomes then a very unspecific proposal and thus also very uninteresting to actually participate in. Yes, you can post a comment. Actually, just as a side note, one of our somewhat hilarious discussions about potential titles for the show at one point was "You Have Zero Friends." Everybody who is involved in Facebook and other sites knows what that means. Or "You Have Zero Comments." Our director didn't like it. So this idea that you sort of just give the space that you have been given by the institution as an artist, so in a generous gesture to your students, maybe, or to the public in general, is often just a gesture, and does not yet constitute a difference in the way you relate to the public. And I was specifically interested in works that actually produced a public, if only maybe for a certain hour, or if only for a certain time. But in this case, it was also a representation of that public. And there's been another project that was organized by the educational department called the 1,000 Journals. And that's an idea where, it's this guy who calls himself some guy, so has an artistic logo, just distributes these journals, and then you add a page to it, and then you send it again. It's a bit like mail art, going back and forth. And so it becomes this really collaborative piece of writings and drawings, etc. And then the format is the journal. But I still find that quite unspecific. And so I was actually listening to Boris Groys on a podcast last night. I still have that, and he gave a lecture that was, I guess, related to this text that he's written, where he talks about self-design and how the artist is sort of forced to design himself as an artist, since there is no value anymore attached to whatever he produces. And so the role of the artist has become, certainly throughout the 80s, or ever since the 80s, has become so much more glamorous and important, and whether it's Douglas Gordon or Damien Hirst, etc. I mean, we all know these glamorous names that have become reevaluated through the art market. There is also that's a kind of cynical response, I think, to that whole problem. And the one thing that is certainly very prominent in San Francisco and the Bay Area, but I think also here at the Otis College of Design, is the idea of social practice, that you then go sort of outside the art into a sort of different field, take on different tasks, more political roles, more social roles.
Like public practice, public practice.
It's called public practice here.
Where at Suzanne Lacey.
Yeah. And
practice,
it's called social practice at CCA.
At CCA and public practice at Otis.
Right, and in Portland with Harold Fletcher, it's called yet something else.
Right. So
we basically invited these three schools to have kind of a closing symposium that we just hosted in the museum. And
but there is one needs, just as you yourself are engaged in some kind of critical relationship to the institution that you work within, right, within the writing and also some of the discourse that you articulated today, in terms of applying certain critical pressures on the institution, perhaps. That there should be something sustainable here, not beyond the exhibition, in one way or another.
No, absolutely.
One also has to think about, the kind of residual ideologies associated with certain kinds of public practices, whether they be, coming out of the more fluxus orientation, whether it's sort of, or Capra in terms of certain kinds of projects, or it's more community-based practices, or even Tierra Venetia, working out of the gallery scene in New York beginning in the late 80s, that there is this kind of residual idealism and idealization of a kind of social ubiquity and this idea of coming into contact with publics that often, I think, has been romanticized. I'm not suggesting that it's been romanticized within your exhibition, certainly not, because I don't think it has, but we, so I wonder if that can be maybe one kind of...
So this idea of micro-utopias that get produced or enacted, yeah. No, I know.
As case studies, in a sense, for how society...
Or from a new sort of social context, and maybe fail again, but I think having gone through performance art, through fluxes, through happenings, a whole set of quite radical proposals in the 60s and 70s that were a lot about sort of the physical impact and the working on the body, and also maybe a failure in the end of that. So you recognize that, but I don't think there is going to be a solution to that. And I was one of the key questions for me in the beginning was this call for participation is very ambivalent, because you might still want to ask, so I'm supposed to participate, but in what exactly? In your politics, or in when my family says, you've got to participate in this family reunion, it's a duty. It's a social obligation, and so on. So participation is not a neutral term, but has to be embodied and enacted in very specific conditions. And I think that there are conditions that are, let's say, more favorable than others, and that produce a more interesting work. And maybe the quality of a work can be considered when you look at the processes that have happened. So when you have a platform and an open invitation and nobody has come, you should revisit that strategy, I guess. Maybe the party was not inviting enough. Or maybe the timing was wrong, whatever. So, and again, as I said also in the beginning, I don't really have an answer to these questions. It was literally an attempt to say. Actually, I should backtrack a little bit. I actually majored in English literature in the mid-'80s, and I wrote about James Joyce, my first thesis. And one of the things I learned from Joyce is that you do not have to be afraid of making mistakes. And that is a central issue in an institution, specifically, I think in American institutions, which is extremely afraid of making mistakes and of losing control. And so when you've done this, you realize actually you don't have to be afraid of that. It's not the box of Pandora that's opening up a can of worms only because you lose curatorial control. As a matter of fact, we don't have to romanticize this. In the end, you still are in control. You're still inside the museum walls. You're still in charge, etc. And you will intervene probably when something illegal happens. But you also allow for things to happen that were unpredicted. And that is, I think, the fact that more than 700 people actually came back to produce this sort of day of just gathering and talking about the work. What does it actually mean that we're not getting our portrait? Why is it doing that? So it's not just you experiencing that moment of transaction between the photographer and you as the model, but then all of a sudden you know there is a discourse generated by it. And I think that kind of moment is then very productive and insightful. And it only happens every so often.
You mentioned that the beer salon you saw as a failure.
No, not the salon. The free cell stack to fold furniture.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Very simply because it was too difficult to do, and also, but that's not so important here now. Maybe the space was overdetermined in its functionality. There were 10 people who had to organize events and that had to function, and it was extremely difficult.
But in regards to the free beer salon, you said it brought about awareness about how much the museum lacks this sociability. Do you see anything coming out of that for the museum as an institution to help, promote interactions like that space was able to in the future? Or
yes, I think, well, maybe most of you have been at one point in your life at SFMOMA, but you can also take LACMA or many other museums. You walk in and you think you're in a bank. It's certainly not a very welcoming space. It has all kinds of ideologies ascribed to the architecture. Specifically, I can talk about SFMOMA. The architect thought of the lobby as a kind of public space, a sort of arena. And it's everything else, but it's not a public space. Because there is a very austere architecture, and there is a very small door, and there's all this kind of hermetic space around it.
Well, is it a port thing? A
port?
A port, as in a transit port, to issue for bodies through into.
Yes, yes, but and then it's used for events and so on. It is. I think it's a space that we all would want to see changed.
Do you think the issue is more with the architecture than anything?
Well, the architecture and also the way we function. And I think you have to kind of not only claim that, you also have to manifest that. You have to literally make people understand that this is something that can be done. So it was done temporarily here. It's something that we would want to see more and in more places and more often. So you create almost a desire to see it actually to become enacted.
Do you also notice that the absence of food might be a factor?
The absence of food.
Well, the absence of food in and around the space, because this is an event where there was beer passed around, and I would only imagine that if you did try to get an audience like that on a normal basis, there would be this administrative.
Okay. Yeah.
That would,
All right.
and
Yeah,
I feel like.
well, no, you can't change everything. One of the things I wanted to do is, you saw this picture of the installation that we have, and the original idea was that the salon would be right behind that, and with kind of direct proximity, the former installation and the actual salon space, event space. However, that would have meant to actually bring in liquids, organic things, horrific for all our conservators. And it proved to be a very challenging and almost impossible job to take the center of the whole show as this kind of hybrid space that would see, the salon, would see performances and all kinds of things. And so in the end, we were forced to relocate that idea to another floor, and then we had the job of, how do you link all these various displaced spaces in the museum into one coherent exhibition. But something I've learned working in institutions is there's always a rule that says, no, you cannot have organic materials next to Robert Rauschenberg. But then again, you see, but wait a minute. If you go back in history, you've done this, you've done that. And, oh yeah, I know, then we negotiated. And there's always a way around it. You just have to negotiate that. And these rules are certainly made because there is some logic to it. So it just needs, it involves negotiation, and that is time consuming, actually. So anything that goes beyond just the selection and the shipping and the unpacking and hanging on the wall is actually a lot more time consuming. At the same time, it is so much more rewarding because all the people who were involved in that process, in the end, felt they were almost like stakeholders in this exhibition. And they shared a responsibility for this.
Do you plan?
Sorry. Okay.
Sorry. Do you plan on collecting the documentation from Flickr or from other public sites? Like how do you negotiate a public website and how you are going to document kind of the reception of the exhibition?
Well, the idea was that we would look at the way the public documents the show, and then just gather all these materials, and then have an artist again come in and sort of make that a process, and if you wish, a product, or a number of options. But we would not do it ourselves. We would just, be instrumental in gathering all these materials, and eventually even clear copyrights with those who posted things. And the idea basically is that there should be another way of publishing. And like every curator is fond of just doing a catalog. I'm not free of that. But at the same time, you also want to see a more open process in terms of publishing and incorporating the review, the revision, and the extensions into that publishing. But right now, it's...
And that also makes sense for a collecting museum of history to actually engage in the kind of historiographic process by incorporating, not only specialized responses, but also non-specialized responses.
Yeah. So one of the initiatives that my colleague, Dominic Wilson, who's running the public programs and the education, who was very influential and sort of almost a co-curator of this whole initiative, he did a series of conversations that were called After Dark, and it's based on a British TV series, talk show series of the 80s, where they would start at, I think, 8 o'clock to talk, and then it was open-ended. There was no clear format and no clear definition when this talk would ever end, until sheer exhaustion would sort of pose the natural end to it. So he did that 3 times with about 8 to 10 participants coming from the community of San Francisco, from all kinds of fields, including 1 or 2 from the museum. And then you would have a list of works that this group would talk about, kind of a talk show format, recorded with 4 different cameras, all with the intention of producing different voices on talking about art. And I was part of one conversation after dark, which went from 8 to 3 o'clock. And at 2:30, I said, listen, I'm done. You can go on, but I'm leaving. And we had one work that was newly acquired by the museum, a curtain by Felix González Torres, which is, golden beads that are basically just covering a whole wall. And that was the entrance to a show that was actually parallel to the art of participation. A collection-based show, and some confounded that and thought, there was Felix González Torres here and there, so that is related. But it was actually 2 different shows. So by actually having a group of 10 people sort of go through this curtain again and again, look from one side, look from the other side, and it was kind of artificial because it was late at night. There was no one in the museum. It's kind of an awkward feeling. It doesn't feel natural, I tell you. You have a specific guard that's just following you now through the museum, but it's so quiet. It's strange. But however, it produced a very interesting discussion that was really, that sort of brought to the fore that it was actually misplaced in this show. And it looked fantastic, it looked great, like a big theatrical opening. You walk through this curtain and then you're in the show. But it did not produce more than that. And then we came to a number of possible solutions to that by kind of having maybe another wall behind that. So you're walking through, but then you're faced with a wall and you're not going anywhere. So thinking through a number of different ways of staging that piece, that felt really productive. So it was, it then depends on the engagement of every single of these participants. And some, throughout the evening just said, I just find it beautiful. I don't really have anything else to say about this. I just find it beautiful. To some who were very critical of the work, and so on. And I think what we both shared in this as a kind of interest is I find a conflicting perspective on the work always good, always insightful. I learn a lot from why you don't like this, whereas this is my favorite piece, almost. And I don't see any reason why a catalog or a museum could not show sort of the conflicts around the work. Something SFMOMA has problems with as an institution.
But it's not only your institution, it's the institution more abstractly or ideologically speaking of art history, of critical discourse, that has certain territories, and it's a relation.
It's not only that. I'd say it's also, certainly in our institution, 50% the expectation of the public, the general public, is you're paid. You tell me what this is about. I want to be instructed. I want to learn, and I want to have an educational experience in this. And when you tell them, well, actually, I don't know. I can point you to this aspect and to that aspect, but I don't have really an answer to what this means. You get a lot of negative feedback.
So the public, in a sense, then is the client, essentially.
Well, those who pay $12 to get in and want to have an educational experience, some takeaway.
I have a question. In the catalog, there's a lot of, I think it's related to what you were talking about. There's a lot of other artists that you mentioned in little side notes in the catalog. but that are not in the exhibition. So what was the final criteria for inclusion and exclusion of some of those groups?
Very pragmatic. We think of it as something that is a process that sort of maps the trajectory of 50 years, from Cage onward. And then you try to think of certain seminal works that maybe could exemplify that narrative. And then it's relatively easy to get certain pieces and very difficult to get others. There are cost factors. I can tell you one of my desires would have been to get a Robert Rauschenberg from the early 60s, which is in a museum in Germany called Black Market, and it was one of the first paintings and assemblages in which he had this idea that there is this bag and people place objects into that bag and it becomes a market, and you bring in something and you take something out. Obviously you can't do that in a museum anymore. You can't touch this. No, this is a Robert Rauschenberg. So it would have been kind of exhibiting that, but also telling the story of how work changes the moment it enters a museum collection. But it was just impossible to get. And others were basically lack of space. So rather think of the catalog more as a network of additional references that work in terms of juxtaposition. Yes.
I have a question about, I guess it's referencing perhaps some of the earlier questions that were made, particularly some of your comments that you made about the lack of sociability that's been an intriguing question here. The white cube dilemma, and also this institutional inflexibility, right? That obviously curators who work in a collecting institution like SFMOMA, obviously there's a certain criteria where you have to frame the collection, you have to reframe it, and you have to bring it to dialogue with certain other things and other points. But I'm also curious about the role of curating with these types of projects, right? Is it perhaps also that the sort of that the role of that requires perhaps a different space? Maybe the white cube and the institutional inflexibility dilemma that you're running across is because in fact it's that.
Absolutely.
And so perhaps the question of curating perhaps also extends to the question of public programming. The role of curating extends to other arenas that then reach out as sort of branches from the museum, but are not the museum necessarily itself.
No, I totally agree. But this was a collaborative process for this show, so the public programs were very crucial. I did say, for a number of reasons, for very pragmatic reasons, we were not able to include projects that kind of involved the outdoors and the open space. And the one thing that is a desire for all curators working in our institution is having more variability in terms of spaces in which you work. So while the white cube is great for certain shows, it is clearly a restriction for many others. And we all know this, but then again, that's the space you have, and all you can do is to kind of generate an excitement about the necessity to have more and other spaces. And as a matter of fact, we were on a very good way through the 2008 planning an extension of the museum that was precisely about getting a different kind of space. And then, who knows?
But I mean, I think Bill raises a good point in terms of sort of the extensions of a curatorial practice, right, which does involve public programming and generating other publics, right? But there's also I mean, like Palais de Tokyo in Paris is a good example of this, in which there is this sort of reutilization of a space, right, a kind of quasi-industrial space that is left half raw, in which the processes of creation are exposed to the public, and so there's another fiction created or generated in that as well. So while yes, we understand the restrictions of the white cube, but also perhaps the endless possibilities of the white cube, the idea of other spaces, whatever that means, also runs the risk of generating the idea that somehow this is closer to some reality, to some quotidian, kind of situation, to something grounded, more fundamental. And I think that there are also some problematics there that need to be rooted out. And that also, frankly, extends to the question of the notion of whether it's the curator or the artist or the institution re-embedding itself into neighborhood or community. Ute Mette-Bauer was here a few weeks ago, and she talked about Documenta that she worked on with and Hirshhorn, and and sort of the problematics there, right, in terms of site and space, and the kind of the kind of externalization of the institution into the banlieue within the Musée Caractère, for example.
Yes.
So it's
I wouldn't have that illusion that you get more to reality, or more of this or that, or deeper, or but I do think that spaces need to change in relation to the artistic practice, and that you have to have a certain equivalence or balance between the kind of practice that is happening, and that you have sort of the role of also documenting and collecting and preserving, and the spaces you need for that kind of work, which is nothing. It's not to say that this is then closer to something, but I do think that institutions have to change in general, but it is just damn difficult. I mean, it requires millions, and it builds structure, and it's a landmark, and so on and so on. So the let's say the easiest way of doing that, working inside an institution, is by raising the importance of an artistic practice, and by saying, this is really where we should be going, and we need to incorporate that. And then it is eventually maybe a reflection of a society that is appropriate. So me being a media arts curator, I feel that we have to be much more aware of our real space being a data space. And that is something you can also relate to curating, that you need to work a lot more on that level of a virtual space. And I think that SFMOMA is actually on a pretty good way in that aspect. My problem is more that it's less the issue of space and more the issue of control. And there's a very clear policy in place that is about controlling every aspect of the whole process of collecting and showing art, under the name or in the name of quality. And I don't know what that is, quality. I mean, how do you make that decision that, it's, certainly you can say the images I showed were bad quality. I'll look for better images next time. So there is this idea of, good resolution. But coming from a whole history of media art, that was an ideological argument against video art from television. You've got bad resolution. We don't want your stuff. You cannot broadcast that. The same thing you hear today again from editors and publishers. You can't publish a video image. That's ridiculous. It's not about resolution. It's not about quality. And it's rather the kind of image that you want to communicate. And if the image is polished, then you want that kind of control. But if the image of the institution is actually about reflecting artistic practice, then you don't have that issue anymore. So I can tell you that whole process was driven by our editors. The catalog editors were driving, or are driving, a lot of exhibition projects, I can tell you. You have to have a decision right now because we're going to print.
And I was wondering if you saw the show that was at Guggenheim. That's also
Any space whatsoever?
Yeah.
No, I didn't.
Oh.
I heard a lot about it.
Yeah.
I did read, to make a more polemic point, I did read about a thing, was that Philip Perino? Somebody who set up sleepover in the museum?
The hotel.
Yeah.
The one in the hotel.
For $700?
I think that was Carsten Holler.
Oh, Carsten Holler?
Yeah, it was Carsten.
I don't know. And I thought, for $700, I think you should offer a sleepover for free.
To me, this was a follies show. It was a folly, in the historical sense of the folly. But we don't need to go into that because that's something very. But one thing I wanted to say in terms of, we have to wrap up imminently.
Could we follow that? But why I thought though is I thought that the show had so many problems.
Which show?
The Guggenheim show.
But we're okay.
Oh, and just that it brings up this question of institutions trying to follow things that are anti-institutional.
But I can't really talk about it because I haven't seen it.
Yeah, but I
would
feel like
just say,
you
as much as I admire some of those artists involved in that, I do not necessarily think that they have anything particularly interesting to say about participation.
And none of them are anti-institutional, fundamentally.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
from personal knowledge and from, none of them are anti-institutional.
Right.
They learn the lessons of institutional critique.
Yeah.
None of those institutional, as Andrea Fraser spoke about at the top of the term, I think, for us, that she was never anti-institutional. I mean, this is a misnomer,
Yes.
and certainly Pepino and Liam Gillick, I mean, these are all people who want to be inscribed into our history in one way or another. And so the notion of being anti-institutional is a fallacy. I'm sorry to say this, but it is.
Yes, I would say there's, there have been a number of design bars and lounges and all of that. And I'm aware of that, but I actually wanted to make the point that if you look at Tom Orion, he's done that 20 years earlier, and he's still doing it. There is, in a way, an honesty to just keep doing it that I think should be recognized and acknowledged. And it's clearly not a gesture, not a design as anti-institutional or social space. So a lot of that is the design of social spaces, but and you know, I'm certainly not against having a great lounge for watching videos, absolutely. Which is why, you know, I wanted to include Dan Graham, you know, as being one of those artists who kind of formulated the architectural aspects of that early. So in a way, I was trying to go back to, as much as possible, to moments when things were formulated for the first time.
I just had a question about the public right queue. So it's, I was wondering what happened to the funds procured from the eBay auction?
What happened?
What happened because of that part of it?
Okay, I can tell you technically it's not art.
Okay.
So it was just dumped.
Was it development money or just, okay.
Well, the artist certainly had the right to sort of take it back.
Okay.
But that was not the point. It was just sand, commercially bought sand, and then the rest was.
Or I meant the money collected from the eBay auction.
Oh, okay, I see. I didn't get the point. That was, well, first of all, the artists got that money.
Okay.
And they basically paid an editor and a translator to constantly update the website with sort of, they had like curatorial text for each opening.
So the winner of each eBay auction, was that person credited or referenced
Yes.
somehow? Okay. And I thought it was also interesting, it seemed like all the people that, the winning bidders were artists themselves, and then so that kind of...
Yes.
Okay.
They were artists.
Okay.
Otherwise, why would you bid? Why would you want to exhibit?
Maybe just a very wealthy person.
Yeah, I mean, I kept telling, everybody said, well, anybody can register. I said, your mother can do it. But then she didn't. No, I mean, I would have loved to see and hear that controversy had somebody really placed thousands of dollars. But then, again, it's only the anxiety that something like that could happen, but in reality, it's just $200. I think the largest bid ever was $300. But, no, you had your wall text, you had everything for a week. Which is also this idea, well, yes, of course, you know, anything can happen, but then they also stand for that. They have to take responsibility. They are being named as the authors of this intervention. And if you just do some crap, then that's what you stand for. So it better be intelligent. Last question.
I had a question. You had Matthew Barney in the exhibit, right? And a part of his work was actually, I know his work is a part of the process, and so I was wondering if anybody was invited to witness his piece on the wall, and if you ever considered videotaping it so that, museum goers can see it.
It was taped.
Oh, I didn't see the
Yeah,
video.
it was exhibit done. It was, he produced a film, a high definition film, on this drawing restraint performance. That's in our collection now. It was exhibited on the third floor. Sort of as you walked up, you would see that film, and then you saw the site of the. You missed that. That was before my time. I arrived just that summer when it was closing, right, just closing.
Well, as with the discussions that you were alluding to at the museum that went on until 3 o'clock in the morning, we will not impose that on you because then I would have to triple your honorarium, which I'd be happy to do. Thank you very much.